It's your mark. Mark.
Mark, set, rolling.
Rolling. Rolling. Want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is week 6 of our lessons in a handbook for new Stoics. So as we go through this, we're learning new things each and every single week. And this week, what I thought was very interesting, because I called this the thinking ahead exercise. It is technically called the Latin Premeditatio Malorum.
Good job.
Yes. And I'm simply a meditation of bad stuff happening, which is interesting too, because often in our lives we're not told to think about the bad things that are going to happen, but it's a way to mentally prepare yourself in case they do. So you run through the scenarios of, all right, I'm going to go, I don't want to use a bad example, but I'm going to drive to work today. Okay, what potential obstacles could I drive to work? You could range from I might get a car accident to there might be another accident. It might take me twice as long to get to work as it normally would. So if you think through those options, and Sarah uses this example of traffic quite well, is if you think through, is there anything I can do about this traffic? No. Okay, so I'm sitting in the car. That might put you in the mindset of, okay, what opportunities do I have in the car if something bad were to happen that I can make the most of this? Maybe it's listening to an entire podcast. Maybe it's having a conversation with a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. Maybe it's just being silent in the car. Maybe that's what you need. So that's what I took really out of this exercise. And I think it's Seneca in his letters to Lucilius. It says, if an evil has been pondered beforehand, the blow is gentle when it comes. That being the idea behind this is that if you think through these scenarios, if something does happen, you're prepared for it. So you're not going to have a meltdown necessarily if you do the proper mental preparation.
Yeah.
It's that whole idea of people constantly say, like, I never thought that would happen to me, or I never thought I would be the victim of fill in the blank. When in reality, like, bad things could happen to you at any moment. You know, a plane could crash into the roof of your house. I mean, anything could happen.
Right. Yeah, and I to that point here, I like to kind of add the second point of what Seneca said. He said, to the fool, and to him who trusts in fortune, each event as it arrives comes in a new and sudden form. Again, it's I had no idea. You know, how could this happen to me? It's that same principle. And it's interesting because when I first started studying and learning about Stoicism, it was interesting because Rob mentioned this to someone. He's like, oh yeah, Amy does this whole, visualization of what could go wrong. And it was very interesting because the person, who's a very smart person, but he was kind of taken aback, and he's like, well, why would you do that? Why would you want to think about the bad? Because, so much in self-help and, personal development, or talk about, manifest, think about what it is you want. What are your goals? What do you want to achieve? If you envision it, that's what you'll get. And so to him, he thought, well, envisioning the worst means the worst is what you're focusing. And I'm like, no. It's not the thing that you focus on. It's not the thing that you constantly are reminding yourself of. It's simply doing a quick preparation to say, okay, what could happen so that I'm not, taken by surprise, or I'm thrown off course, or it completely derails where I'm visioning I do want to go. It's basically, it's just like you're traveling. You plan a route, but sometimes along that route there might be detours, and it's knowing that up front, whether you know exactly about the detour or just simply being able to anticipate, well, reality says that probably at some point along our route from Florida to Maine, which is a pretty big track, somewhere along there we're probably going to bump into some traffic. We're probably going to have a detour.
Yeah.
So being able to mentally be aware of that, and also if you have a time frame, giving yourself a buffer for, this may happen, so we have to be a little bit more flexible with our time. I always like to think back to, I don't know if you remember these, Sierra, but Rob, I think you kind of do, but I remember back in the day before we had Google Maps and smartphones, we had AAA trip tickets. Do you remember those? Did you ever do any of those?
Triptychs.
Mm-hmm. They were fantastic.
I didn't do it, but I remember. Yeah.
I'm sure. No, I don't think we have any of our old ones from my grandfather, but I remember every trip we took, because we drove a lot. Any trip we took, we would first go to AAA, and they would pull out wherever you were going, they would pull out each segment, and they would have a stamper, and they'd be like, there's a detour, there's road construction right here along your route when you're going, so be aware, they like draw out the detour, so that way you know where to go. And again, it may be that by the time you got there, it was gone, it was done and taken care of, but you knew ahead of time to prepare for it.
And to your point about your friend too, it's like, you still want to have a spare tire in your car. Just because you have a spare tire doesn't say, hey, Nails, find my tire. It's that like you wouldn't not have it's not you manifesting a broken tire, a flat tire. It's just, it's there as your Premeditatio Malorum. I mean, it's like, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
2 for 2, you guys.
We're Latin experts here on the porch.
Good job.
So I'd love to see, because one of the other points that they bring up in this lesson is that the Stoics talked about Premeditatio Malorum, but they didn't really give a guide on how to do it. So they gave us several options on how to do it. So one was, you could take some examples, a goal that you have for today, say, okay, I wrote, for example, to sleep well. And then I said, okay, well, what would happen if it didn't go well? Then you have another option of kind of, walking through other people's adversities. So, and then you can try to put yourself in their shoes, if you will. So like, okay, if that happened to you, which ties into some of the other lessons that we've learned here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to know from you guys, which one of the exercises, I think they gave us 3 options total, that you liked the best, that you thought was the most effective. Sierra, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, well, my favorite, I had 2. So the first method helped me with big picture, kind of that take a look back, which I think we just talked about last week. But for problem solving purposes, the third method worked the best for me. Let me look at my notes here. So the third method is to imagine a situation you wouldn't want to happen as if it's actually happening. This approach is similar to imaginal exposure, a type of exposure therapy to help people overcome their anxiety. So basically, like if you're afraid of snakes, go in a pit of snakes, and figure it out. So this one helped me the most as far as calming my emotive brain down, because they ask you to write out several, and they don't want you to start in the guide. They don't want you to start with the 10 being the thing that scares you the most. They want you to pick something kind of in the middle that's enough for you to feel that, but not so much that it completely freaks you out.
Mm-hmm.
So I had an assortment of things from and then they ask you, how hard would this be to cope with on a scale of 1 to 10? So I wrote down 5 things. I had a 2, a 4, a 5, a 6, and an 8.
Mm.
And this really helped me to kind of to see, because a lot of times you think about the things that you don't want to have happen, your dispreferred, as the Stoics would call it. But it's unusual to rank them, actually. Like, what of the most terrible things that could happen is the worst?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's other things
like,
I didn't want to write
yeah.
down, like some of the worst things. I'm like, I didn't want to write these down, because they make a point that they don't want you to necessarily go to the 10.
Yeah, but they say,
yes.
It's okay that you're feeling discomfort, and that's really that's the genesis of this whole exercise, is that so often we avoid thinking about the things that make us uncomfortable, and then because of that we are completely taken or thrown off course or taken aback and not able to effectively cope with it. It even, again, I'll get pretty deep here, but I know we're not supposed to talk about times, but things like death, people they are not comfortable thinking about death, even if it's someone who is clearly, all of us are on the path.
But it's an elevated age.
Yes, but at an extremely elevated age, let's say tipping in the 90s, and to still be taken by surprise by it, or to not be able to effectively handle it, it's just being able to do that exercise to recognize every single one of us is at some point going to end up there.
97% according to Ricky Bobby.
Yeah, according to Ricky Bobby, 97%.
Can I I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, that was a lesson for me with my grandfather. My grandfather, was it 2 years ago he passed away?
Mhm.
He was 92 years old. In the last year and a half of his life, he was suffering. So the lesson for me was, in letting him go, he got to be at peace. So rather than worrying about trying to prolong his life so he's alive for us, or he's still around, or whatever we say to ourselves, the challenge that I went through with that was, okay, now he doesn't have to suffer anymore. So he's in, I think, a better place than he would be suffering from Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And just continuing to deteriorate, because it really excelled quickly in the last year and a half of his life. It just was a downhill slide, and it was hard for, because I didn't live near him, but it was hard for my mother to watch and her two brothers to watch, and the whole family. So instead of being comfortable with him being here, it was getting to the place where it was comfortable that he got to move on and be at peace.
Yeah.
But not everybody thinks that way. Not everybody thinks the afterlife is a peaceful life, or there is one, or nobody knows what it is. But I obviously came up with that conclusion that, for me, he's now, up there telling stories to other people that used to tell us.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And then, from what they're trying to get you to think about is, in a sense, like you as an outsider, right, you think like, oh, the guy is 92, like you should be expecting that he's got less days in front of him than he does behind. And yet somehow it still always surprises us. It's like we haven't thought it through. When, if you've been through a death in your family, or especially a death that's really close to you, like I've had an experience where I've had to actually handle all of the logistical things that happen, is that, there's all these things that have to happen. And if you had premeditated it and gotten their final wishes, had a plan in place, it's a lot easier than if you're just like, well, let's see, I guess he wants to be buried. I guess he, wants white flowers. I don't know. It's that preparedness. And what I think they're trying to get you to do here is, if you can think about it, not only does it emotionally prepare you, like, yes, every person who is born is going to die, and we don't know when, and that's a truth of the universe. And what you believe what happens after is completely up to what your own thoughts and beliefs are. But being prepared, not only from a logistical standpoint, being ready to have the reactions, do the stuff, but also emotionally, like being able to let it go. Like you said, you had a hard time, letting him go and making peace with the fact that he indeed was gone and there was nothing that was in your control.
Yeah. And I mean, death is obviously probably one of the most extreme examples of something to cope with, but you're right. I mean, it's just being able to be willing to have the uncomfortable conversations with others for things like preparedness, whether it's preparedness of, having some ducks in a row, having some things in place, because you could go down to the store and that might be it. Right? But it's having that, but also being willing to have the uncomfortable conversations with yourself, not even necessarily about death, but something that otherwise might make you uncomfortable. Like, I love that, to your point, they're not saying start with the 10, because the 10 is going to be a little bit tough, but recognize what the 10s might be and then start to, prepare yourself bit by bit to get used to it. But he even talks about here, or they say, take the example of the cup from, what was it, week 3, where it was talking about the cup. If a servant of yours broke one of your cups, how would you feel? Versus if somebody else's cup was broken, how would that make you feel? If something that was a prized possession of yours got broken, because it could happen, right? But it's just having that, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And again, the whole intent is to, as they say, loosen our attachment to external events. Again, just loosening the attachment to the things that are not within our control. So that way we are not frustrated, we are not angry, we are not sad, or, we can still feel,
At a total, like,
yes.
paralyzed with
Inconsolable.
sadness. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you guys want to share, what did you guys write down as far as your external situations to premeditate? because I kind of ran the gamut, but I kept mine between a 2 and a 5. I didn't go too crazy.
Okay.
So I started, for
Well,
example,
I can
with,
tell you.
yeah, no, please.
I can tell you. I was surprised by this. But my highest one that I did, my 8, was hurricane damage.
Yeah.
And this trumped my other ones, which included like getting COVID, which I was actually a little surprised about, because once I actually had to give them numbers. And so for a little bit of background, it's been about a year and a half since I moved from Phoenix to South Florida. So hurricanes are still kind of a new thing for me. And I'm very passionate about my house and my home being my sanctuary. So that was, of the things I listed, that was like the worst thing that I kind of had myself work through. And after I actually worked through it, I felt better, because I really kind of thought like, okay, if the house is completely gone, you can buy a new house. And if your stuff is gone, it's just stuff.
Yeah.
You know, so that really helped me to kind of calm my anxiety, because that was a higher number than I originally thought when I started making my list.
That's very interesting in and of itself, that you worked through it, where if you didn't actually do the Premeditatio Malorum, you may have thought it would have been a 9 or a 10 or a 12 or something like that, because that's a massive thing. And then when you do it and think about it, like, okay, let me work through this logically and go through the steps, just like you said, Sierra, with, you know, if it's a death situation and you've planned, okay, they want to be buried or cremated, or, you know, all the steps. I think that's exactly what this exercise is. So one of the quotes that I love, and I talk about it in my course that will be coming up soon, is from Louis Pasteur, who, you know, pasteurized milk, etc. He said, chance favors the prepared mind. And that's exactly what this exercise is. So in similar to what we'll be doing in some of my course, is just exactly that, is thinking ahead about, okay, who could react what certain way, or, you know, you run through the gamut of, when you have something to say, who's going to react a certain way, even though you know you can't control it, but be prepared for each of the reactions, if you will. So I think that's exactly what you're doing. You're preparing your mind in case some chance like that happens, some extreme hurricane scenario happens.
And it's not ruminating on it. Truly, you're not supposed to think of everything that could possibly go wrong and having everything prepared ahead of time for how to pivot if it does go wrong. I mean, you could go that far, but then that's a lot of time spent not doing the thing you actually want to be doing. But at the same time, it's just meant to help you be okay with when it happens, to then be able to pause, think, analyze, and pivot. That's really what it's trying to handle at the end of the day. So that way, you know, you're not just like, I don't know what to do. I'm just, you know, circling the wagons. I have no idea what to do next. I can't think straight.
And somebody has to come in and do it for you.
Somebody has to come save you.
Right.
Save you from yourself.
And this exercise didn't ask me to do this, but after I made the first list with the numbers, and then I thought through each one, the hardness level, that number would have gone down if they'd asked me to record that. It would no longer be an 8 now, after I kind of like had to Premeditatio Malorum. Then I'm like, okay, all right, you know what? A hurricane comes, it's a force of God, force of nature. We would just deal with it.
Right. You don't have the power to be like, no, you must pass. You must pass this house.
Yeah. Everything around me is in shambles, but this house is pristine. You know,
how is that possible?
Well, that would bring up a whole nother thing you'd have to deal with. There'd be some guilt associated with that, I'm sure. Like, every house is destroyed except mine. That's weird. And I caused it. That'd be a whole nother thing.
I created my bubble barrier.
Yes. So what'd you write, Amy?
So I wrote, I had 3, and kind of similar to you, Sierra. Even as I was writing them, I put a number, and then I was like, well, but really, will it be that bad? Maybe, probably not. So one of mine, I talked about not having any sales for the company. That would be really hard to cope with.
Right.
But more from an ego perspective, truly, is why it would be hard to cope, because the reality is that you know, it will be what it is, and it will be a reflection of the product and the marketing and everything. So there's things within that we can control to a point, but ultimately, as we've said before, we can't control the purchasing power of others. We can simply just try to influence them. So I put that one fairly high, but even as I wrote the number, I was like, well, I could probably deal with that more. I also said, for some reason, if the stock market like completely crashed and we lost all of our investments,
Sure.
At first I was thinking, oh, that's going to be terrible. But I was like, it's more like a 5, because you know what? It's just losing everything right now. We've made this much up until now. We can make some up until next, whatever next is. So I was like,
Exactly, because it's on paper. Unless you're need to sell it at that moment, you just ride that wave.
Right. Exactly. And then kind of going along with number 1, it was more if we never sold anything and I'd have to go get a real job again, not finding one, or with not getting hired for one, not finding one. And then even as I wrote it, I literally wrote not finding another job. And then I was like, well, I mean, the reality is I can find another job. It just might not be, the pay I want or the role I want. But the reality is if push came to shove, I could find another job. I'm not going to get hired by someone somewhere.
Correct.
So.
Correct.
Yeah. You guys.
Well, and I love that Amy, I love that you identified with your one that was the worst, that really that what you felt the most of it was the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Was that ego of like, I would be disappointed in just me as a person, whereas it wouldn't be like devastating in such a way as something that might be a 10, is that you were able to step back and see the source of where that fear was coming from, and that source of that fear was a hurt ego. And then after you kind of worked through it, it probably helped you to kind of see like, okay, I could figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of like, what you define failure as, right? So sometimes, it could be an ultimate, devastating failure, if you will, or it's simply just, okay, this attempt, this version of whatever it is trying to design didn't quite work, so let's just adapt. Let's try to tweak it a little bit. So it's not a failure, it's a learn,
Well, that is, and I think sometimes you can draw on your past experience for something like that. So when I lost a job, and it hit me pretty hard because I didn't see it coming, and
you did not premeditatio.
Well, I didn't do it to this extent for sure. I mean, you always have that thought in the back of your mind, because especially in the broadcast industry, whatever. But the point is, what I did is I took a week. I didn't do anything. I kind of processed, and then I talked to Sierra's husband, Chris, and I went to work for him for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, 6 months, whatever it ended up being, valet parking cars. And a lot of people were like, why are you valet parking cars? I'm like, why wouldn't I? I mean, it's a fun job. I'm running around. I work with some great people. I'm driving some fancy cars and backing them into parking spots. Like, it was the interesting thought that, and I'm like, that's what I do. And I will forever be grateful for Chris for giving me that opportunity, because it taught me a huge lesson that, you know what, my happiness level didn't really change between the job, the radio job and valet parking cars. Like, I didn't notice I didn't go into a depression because of it. And I just think the lesson of, that work ethic stays constant. Like, no matter what the job is, to Amy's point, you still can feel value out of doing a good job, no matter what the job is, even if the pay's low or higher, on parallel or whatever. But, and then finding that gratitude in those places you wouldn't expect it. And you can draw back on that and say, well, I had hit a bump in the road, and a friend, made sure I was taken care of. Like, and what else can you ask for? I mean, that's the greatest thing ever. Like, and you think back on that and that lesson and going, all right, if something happened again, people will be there for me.
Yeah.
Well, and you've got a more diversified work portfolio now.
Yeah. And I was surprised at how much fun I had, quite honestly. I was like, this is more fun than I thought. And, that sometimes is fun too, in that, you find surprises and sometimes when you have a change. And, especially I would imagine if you did this exercise and then you found a cool experience out of that, it might even mean more to you because you'd be less on the downside of the emotion and you'd be more willing to look for the upside.
Well, and I mean, we'll get into this, later with some of our teachings and whatnot, but it all goes down. I think a lot of it boils down to like, what is it that you truly value and that fills you up, or, you know, Sierra, to use your term, kind of sparks joy for you. And so often within our careers, we look at the role that we're performing, but truly, if you distill it down further, if you really sit there and you break it down, you'll find that it's not necessarily, it might not necessarily be that specific role. It's a component within that role that is the thing that is filling you up. So for you, you know, connection, I think, is a very important value and drive for you. So connection for initially was defined as connecting with people through the airwaves, through what I'm talking about, through what I'm communicating. But you got that same, you filled up that same tank of connection through what you did with ballet, both through the people that you worked with and the people that you met, you know, while you were interacting with them and parking their cars.
Yeah, and I worked at a property in Arizona, which may have the best view in Phoenix in and of itself. So that wasn't a bad thing either. But even that, it's finding that little thing and finding those bigger picture things that you didn't expect, which can be cool. And, you know, like I said, probably be enhanced if you do this exercise.
Yeah.
It's like we always say in my house, you never know what you'll find when you keep an open mind.
There you go.
It's true indeed.
Another great Sierraism right there.
That's why I got to get that mindfulness course. You'll have all kinds of your own isms.
I know.
Yeah. It's universally applicable.
Well, I think that this is very interesting too, because you mentioned COVID. The times we live in are so interesting too, is we have some now other tensions beyond COVID. So we went from one huge, massive amount of tension around the whole world to another massive amount of tension with what happened to George Floyd. So we're in this interesting spot where people probably want to try to get a better, I'm guessing, because we're trying to do the same thing, a better handle on how to handle any kind of tension that comes your way.
Well, and that's why I really liked method 2, which was premeditating on others' adversity. I thought, how timely of this for really what's going on right now with the, you know, with the Black Lives Matter and the protests. So often we tend to only see things from our own lens. And this was, again, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, thinking about someone else's adversity, you know, the thoughts about things like white privilege or whatnot, but being able to put yourself in someone else's adversity and premeditate on that. I thought that was such a great exercise to be able to do that, especially it just happened to come up, right? You know, this lesson came up right at this time.
Yep. I'll give you an example. So I was doing radio shows during the protest, and Drew Brees made some comments that he would never disrespect the American flag by kneeling, something, I'm paraphrasing the quote. And it was because Drew Brees was paying tribute to soldiers who had served. He says, I would never want to, you know, do anything like, I would never support that. So that became a big touch point because other people had different points of view. And Michael Wilbon, who works for ESPN, he brought up the point, he says, see, that's all fine and great. He's a black man. And he says, our ancestors fought in those same wars. And in particular, World War II, they came back to a different situation than the white soldiers did. White soldiers had parades, and some of the black soldiers were in that. But when the black soldiers went home, they were drinking from different fountains still in many places in this country.
Right.
And I hadn't even considered that. So again, approaching it with an open mind and saying, you know, I was more inclined to be on Drew Brees' side because that's what you're taught in this country. You're taught that the flag represents sacrifice and honor. So I understood where Drew Brees was coming from. But at the same time, the way Michael Wilbon put it, I was like, wow, I see this in a completely different light now that I didn't consider, because no one talks about that when you're growing up. You only talk about the one side. So based on Wilbon's comments and approaching it with an open mind, it allowed me to see it in a different way. And I think, Sarah, you may have even brought this up. Like, when you have your point of view, it's like you're looking straight ahead. When you start adding other people's perspectives, your peripheral vision starts to broaden. So you can see things a whole lot differently, which can help you make better decisions.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the hardest things is to, you know, you don't necessarily have to walk a mile but in somebody else's shoes, but being able to understand that indeed there are other perspectives than the one that you know, and just kind of recognizing that not everybody is seeing everything through the same lens you are, in the same way that, understanding the lens that somebody who is part of the LGBTQ community sees things is very different than somebody who is just a middle of the road heterosexual.
Yep.
It's just their lens. You could walk the exact same street and you could see completely different perspectives about what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. So it's being able to walk in someone else's adversity. Yeah.
Right. And to kind of see and realize that your version of reality is not necessarily everybody else's version of reality.
Right.
That's
Exactly.
been very apparent in these times, as a lot of people dig in and think that their way is the only way.
Yeah.
Like 3-year-old.
And that's never true.
Right, exactly.
It's never true. Yeah.
I gotta take some notes. It's all good stuff.
Mm-hmm. So all in all,
But
Premeditatio Malorum, very helpful exercise and there's a couple different ways you can take it. Taking something that you look at your day and identify within your day things that you want to do and how those could possibly veer off course and what you might think about how to handle when they do veer off course. I'm trying to think it. So, and being able to identify if it does veer off course within that, what can you control? What can you not control? What would you, I liked the part where it was like, what could you tell yourself if it goes wrong?
Mm-hmm.
That's always the good. We always talk about those triggers of instead of cursing yourself out or chiding yourself for something that, whether it was or wasn't within your control, rather than talking negatively to yourself, what could you say to help you get that clear perspective, that take a moment, reflect, all right, not that big of a deal.
Well, I underlined on page 43 about how the Stoics call a passion. A passion is something that clouds your mind, stopping you from doing or thinking what is reasonable. So it's that whole idea of you can feel strongly, but not allowing that to completely just pull the wool over your eyes to see everything. Right.
Yeah, because I liked how when they talk about it, the passion, not all emotions are passions, only the ones that take over your mind, which is such a simple few words there, but it's such a powerful visualization of, literally just to your point, it clouds your view. It prevents you from being able to move forward or think logically or reasonably. So I really liked that too. I did highlight that as well.
Yeah.
Don't make yourself miserable by adding a self-inflicted injury. I like that. That's what I put here too.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And I felt like for me that the whole point of this whole week's, with the Premeditatio Malorum was that it's allowing yourself to be able to, the things that's clouding you, to be able to lift it enough to work through it so that you're not just stuck with this, blinded passion. So I found this week very, very helpful.
All right. I think we're like, 6 for 6 with helpful exercises. So good job, gentlemen, with the handbook.
These gentlemen.
Yeah. Massimo Pigliucci and Gregory Lopez. Massimo is actually he's kind of a funny guy. Just on a side note, you should just Google him and watch a couple of his videos that he has on YouTube. He's a little quirky, but
I'll have to do that.
Stoics are to a point, but he's interesting. He's informative, but he's fairly entertaining to watch as well.
Okay, I'll have to look for him.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool.
All right. So what's week 6? Oh, week 7. I mean, take a much broader perspective.
How about that?
Oh man, even broader. All right.
Yeah.
To that one.
Okay.
All right. Fantastic.
All right, and I'll be kicking us off for next week.
Yeah.
Great job, PPS.
All right. Premeditatio
You want
Power.
to talk about the Facebook group?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So along with this, we're doing this exercise, the 3 of us. But if anyone watching at home, if you want to play along with us, you can do so by signing up for our virtual book club, which includes a private Facebook group where we'll be talking about the week's lesson, sharing each other's insights. It's just a way to help everybody build up their emotional resiliency a little more, especially in these ever-changing, fastly changing times, and having some support between the three of us and a community of people to help support everybody on their journey towards emotional kickassery.
Woohoo!
Send us a note. We'd love to see you in there.
Yep. So you can find the sign-up form on the YouTube videos as well as on our Facebook page.